Welcome to the Dakotan Live Election Cycle Edition. We got some pretty exciting stuff going on today. Excited to be joined by Jared Hendrix. You can see him now. We're going to be breaking down a couple things with him. Before we jump into that, I want to mention something that's really exciting that's dropping tomorrow. We are announcing the launch of the Dakotans Election Central. If you are curious what's happening in the 2024 election cycle, we have the exact place for you to go to. Go to mydakotan.com, and then there'll be a little button there. You can click Election Central. It's going to have everything that's covering the 2024 election cycle. We're going to have a list of all of the current incumbents, a list of all the candidates that are coming up. If you are a candidate or you know a candidate, make sure you reach out to us. Send us an email, info@mydakotan.com. We want to make sure you're on that list, but we're reaching out to all the district chairs so that way we have all that information on that site. You'll be able to filter by whatever means you need to filter so you can find exactly the people you want to know more about. You can click into their profile. In their profile, we're going to have video interviews with them. We will have news articles about them, their releases, their candidate releases, and any other news that comes up concerning them will be right on that page. So you can learn all about them right there. Now, some of this information is going to be ongoing. We've have done several interviews. We have more interviews scheduled, and there'll be even more that we get to do. So some of that information will be coming. You can follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or subscribe to our email list where we will be sending out updates on it all. So you can always have the latest information. You will also be tracking the key races. This goes for statewide offices. This goes for state legislative offices, and it goes for our federal races as well, in the House and Senate. So really excited about that. Make sure you go to mydakotan.com starting tomorrow, mydakotan.com, and click Election Central to find out everything that's going on in the North Dakota election cycle this year. Really excited to have a person that has made him a name for himself in the political space in North Dakota. Excited to have political consultant Jared Hendrix with us today. He's been involved in state politics here in North Dakota for a number of years. He's helped with some key races that if he wants to point out, he can. But first off, welcome to this live stream today, Jared.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me on. Should be fun.
I am looking forward to it. So let's just start off with the question. What's going on in politics, man? It seems like there's some crazy things that are happening, and every cycle it just gets a little bit more crazy at the federal level. So with the presidential race and things like that, it's turning into be something that's going to be very interesting to watch. And then at the state level, we have a crazy amount of turnover. So why don't you start out on the federal level? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, well, the federal stuff really, I think, tends to, trickle down, so to speak, down to every little race in the country. It
Right.
establishes kind of the overall mood and the issues that are out there. And that's probably to some extent always been true, at least in the modern era. Maybe in the 1790s or 1830s, news travel a little slower, maybe it was a little different. But like now in the 24/7 news cycle, it's national politics, it's world politics. You got the presidential horse race, as I like to call it, and obviously that drives out two sides essentially, probably more than two, but really mainly two sides. And all the issues that are happening nationally is what's driving the discussion. That's what most people pay attention to. You ask people like, hey, do you know what the state budget was in Bismarck this last session? Probably not going to know the answer, or at least a good number of them will not. But you ask them what's going on the border in Texas, they probably do know. So that's kind of the way it works. But yeah, it's
Is that a
a
problem?
wild year. Yeah.
Is that a problem that's the way it works? We know more about we're more in tune with what's going on at the border in Texas than we are what's going on with the budget in Bismarck?
That's a good question. I mean, they're both equally important. I think we need to start to think about both local and national as equally important. And of course, those of us are kind of knee deep in politics. We like to think that we do think that way. Maybe sometimes we don't, but but yeah, people need to understand that, all politics is local. These are little catchphrases you hear, but it's true. Especially in North Dakota, where we're really spoiled by how much access we have to our legislators, to our local officials. These are small districts, 16,500 people that are represented by your senator and your two House members. So that's a pretty small number. You go out to like other
Right.
states, like California, whatever, the number's bigger. So yeah, it's we really need to take advantage of how close we are to that, because the closer you are, the easier it is to influence, and the easier it is that you and whatever you care about and your ideas, you can see some kind of impact on it.
Absolutely. So at the federal level in the presidential race, we have it narrowing down on the Republican side. A lot of candidates have dropped out, and it feels like Mr. Donald Trump is once again the front runner. Is that who you see getting the nomination?
Yeah, and that's, I think, been true from the beginning. I mean, if you look at the poll numbers really for the last year, that's uh, I mean, you never want to say never, but with almost complete certainty, that has always been what was going to happen. Um, his position has always been the strongest. His position has always been the strongest in the primary and in the general election. If you look at the polling, I know some people might feel otherwise. And of course, there is some subjectivity that comes into this, but I'm just trying to look at the numbers objectively in terms of enthusiasm and name ID. There are some metrics you can use to measure it, and Trump's numbers have been very high, which is why I personally think he would be the strongest person in the general election for the Republican Party. But people have different opinions about that. Trump has some negatives. Currently, right now, his disapproval ratings are not as high as Joe Biden's, so there's that to consider. But both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have extremely high name ID and extremely high support. So there was almost no way that neither of them were going to not be their respective nominees.
Some people say that Donald Trump. Well, some people would say that either candidate is unelectable. How does that play out? Does that give room for an independent this year?
That's always the thought. And again, you never say never. But historically, look at the data, look at the last
Right.
150 years, really, since we had a pretty solid two-party system. Um, Independents, third parties just rarely perform really well. A few exceptions, obviously Ross Perot, billionaire, got a lot of media coverage, did pretty well. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a former president who ran as a progressive party in 1912, did really well. But for the most part, that is just not the case. It's going to be one part or the other. Ironically, sometimes data will show that as things get more divisive and as people get more divided in the country, more partisan, um, more dislike of both parties, they actually are more likely to vote for one of their two teams, even
Okay.
if they're just voting against the other team. So, that being said, this will be an interesting cycle with a couple of independent candidates that might be able to make ballot access in a few states, like RFK Jr.,
Right.
Jill Stein with the Green Party. The Green Party has pretty good infrastructure and ballot access. Dr. Cornel West, generally seen on a little more of the left side of the spectrum. I don't know how good a ballot access plan that he'll have, because he's not going to get on every state. Neither is RFK, I don't believe.
Okay.
And then you have the Libertarian candidate. Again, Libertarian Party will probably have more ballot access than RFK because they're an organized third party and they have the infrastructure. So that'll make it very interesting.
Yeah. It seems like a candidate like RFK could pull from both sides. So if he was able to get that ballot access that you're talking about, it seems like he would have a chance, probably truly not to destroy the two-party system, but at least get more than normally a independent candidate gets.
Yeah, I think so. And he could play a real role, let's say, in any swing state he's able to get on the ballot in, and whether that, helps Trump or helps Biden is really hard to determine. I think most of the data shows that I think it might slightly help Trump. I mean, the Kennedy name is, a big name in Democratic politics, was a long history, but
Right.
maybe not. I mean, he appeals to some of your working class, blue collar folks in a similar way that Trump does in some areas. So
Yeah.
the polling shows that his base is not really in New England, where his family's from. It's in places like the Midwest and Michigan, and so Yeah, we'll see. It'd be very interesting.
It will be. One more question on that. Um, maybe it might turn into a series of questions, but do you see any shenanigans being pulled by at the Republican convention when it came to nominate Donald Trump?
I think it's very unlikely in the way the rules are written now. And we can have a whole podcast on the
Yeah.
rules some other time, but like, um, it's pretty airtight for, who's winning the caucuses, the delegates being bound. Um, so I would say probably not. That doesn't mean that there might not be a desire to do that, but I think it would be a very tough hill to climb. The one caveat being if Trump were to get convicted on a major charge before
Right.
then, which I don't think I haven't followed every court case close enough to know the timeline on all of them, but I don't think that's likely. But that would be one scenario where maybe there'd be an argument to push to change the rules to allow delegates to change their vote or something like that. But again, I don't think that's very likely. And if if the party leadership did do that, I think it would be a disaster for the party because um, the entire base would implode, and they got to think about down ticket Senate, Congress. I mean, I've said kind of a joke in some ways, but I think it's actually true that even if Trump was campaigning from jail, the Republican Party would still be in a better position to stick with him than if they were to try to eject him. If leadership were to eject him, that would be disaster for the party's base.
Would he have time to get on the ballot as an independent still?
I think that would probably be very difficult, but I'm not an expert on ballot access.
Yeah.
Maybe in
Right.
some areas, but I think
Yeah.
there would be some legal hurdles there.
For sure. Okay, so that's kind of a summation of federal level stuff uh, from a North Dakota point of view. So let's filter it down. Let's look at our legislators because we at our statewide and with our legislators, our federal legislators, we've having a little bit of turnover this year. Obviously, Doug Burgum ran for president. Big deal, right? What was your thoughts on that?
It is a big deal for the state. I mean, he's obviously was reelected by wide margins. He's got his support level. Is kind of an icon in the state, so it was a big deal for us. But again, there was no. I don't want to say that there was no, but there's highly unlikely there's going to be any path to victory for any other
Right.
candidate.
Yeah. And do you think though he worked himself in? It sounds like there's positive signs. Do you think he worked himself into a cabinet position of some type?
That's always possible. Trump's a deal maker. It's his
Yeah.
strength and his weakness.
Right.
So we'll see how that plays out. But I think for sure there's a possibility of that. I mean, he comes from a state that's big in ag, big in energy, um, a lot of potential there. But I don't have a crystal
Yeah.
ball. We'll see.
So he goes and he says he's not running for a third term. So he's done, which kind of also alludes to potentially that maybe there's something coming down the pipe for him. Um, that happens. You have Tom Campbell comes out of the gate strong, says, I'm running for governor. And then Kelly Armstrong, our state representative, says, I'm running for governor as well. And Tom Campbell reconsiders things, decides he's going to run for the representative seat that Kelly Armstrong would be vacating. Um, with that, Rick Becker says, I am running for that representative seat as well. And of course, it didn't end there, as there are others that have declared now. Travis Hipsher, a Democrat, has declared that he is running for North Dakota governor as well. And Trygve Hammer has also declared that he is running for the U.S. House race for the state of North Dakota. So we're starting to see this all kind of begin to play out and really understand who our candidates are. Uh, what's your initial thoughts as you see people declaring, seeing things firm up? Um, two-sided question on what your initial thoughts are. One, is the Republican Party still stable in the state of North Dakota? We've always, since for the last many years, it's just been pretty stable. And now there's a lot of change that's happening all at once. Is this an opening for the Democrats to be able to get back into some of those positions? Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, I think most likely not. Um, Again, I'll repeat that I never want to say never. Things, you
Right.
know, we face a serious economic contraction and things get crazy, who knows what could happen in the country. Um, but I think most likely no. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The Democratic Party has um, some of your more prominent voices, I think, are not in the middle of the road spectrum that they at least were associated with for a long time when they were
Right.
successful up to the early to mid 2000s. And so I think that it's going to be difficult for them to appeal. Plus, again, just the down ticket effect, the national flavor. Um, the party. It's not that the and I stress this very much. It's not that the voters in North Dakota, at least as far as I know, are particularly partisanly loyal to the Republicans. You have a plurality of people in North Dakota that identify as independent. And it's just that they're swinging that way because they're going to vote with the party they think is the best option. And that's not to say there isn't any brand loyalty to Republicans. That is growing over time. I mean, the more people vote that way over time, the more loyalty will occur. But I'm saying initially, it wasn't that long ago. Think about 2012, 10 years ago. Heidi Heitkamp won
Right.
statewide as a Democrat. You know, 10 years ago was kind of a long time in politics, but really not that long ago. So could it happen? Possibly. I've always said if the Democrats get smart and they run somebody who's maybe seen as a blue dog or a more quote unquote moderate candidate who's got high name ID or is well funded, it's possible, yeah, if they have a right message, but they're going to have to probably not have a tone that's maybe as they're going to have to be, I think, more favorable to energy and more culturally reflective of where the state is, and not your kind of far left cultural issues, or they're not going to have appeal.
Absolutely. Eh, I think it's difficult right now and maybe it's not as difficult as I think, but it appears difficult for them to get someone that has high name ID. Um, Feels like both the candidates that are represented, Travis Shipner, he's been around politics a little bit, ran for some other races as well. And Hammer, I'm not sure. I know he's a chair of a district. But I'm not sure what influence. Is there somebody that you can think of that would have that high name ID that might be more better of a candidate? I know that puts you on the spot a little bit.
Um, Not particularly. I mean, there's a few. There's always talk that Heidi would come
Yep.
back. She has a strong name. Her brother
Right.
Joel,
Yes.
Max Schneider, I think certainly did better against Kelly Armstrong in 2018 than anyone since. Um, there's other folks that haven't gotten in races, like Tim Purdon, who is a attorney. There's a few names that are thrown around. There's always a wild card possibility of what I actually think is their most likely path to victory. I hate to make it about money, but if there's a wealthy business person who's, you
Yeah.
know, more moderate, but who has deep pockets, who could get in almost like a Burgum type on the Democratic side, and who could campaign as an outsider and even as somewhat of a conservative Democrat, that would be, and they have the money, that would be one way of them sort of breaking back in. But I don't know that I see that. I mean, we have a 7-1 super Republican majority, very few Democrat seats in the legislature. They have almost no political power there except, some influence in committees, and they can swing, votes if they vote as a bloc. Um, but yeah, I don't see any major names on the horizon that could change it. They would, I think have to sort of resurrect somebody who's got some name ID from the past, or bring somebody in, like I said, who's very wealthy and can make it happen.
Very good. So, if you want to stay up to date on all those races, if you want to learn more about what those candidates are thinking, go to mydakotan.com. And starting tomorrow, February 2nd, we're going to have an election central where we're going to have a database of all the candidates, all the incumbents, our elected officials for those statewide races, for our federal races, and also for our state legislative races, where you can go and learn more about the candidates. You'll be able to see interviews with them. You'll be able to read news articles about them. All that information will be populated more and more over time as more and more information is released. If there's information you want to submit to that, there will be a form that you can go ahead and submit. We'll review it and get it on the site as well. So just want to throw that out there. We're really excited about the Dakotans election central this political cycle. So we've talked about federal. We talked about the presidential race. We've talked about our federal legislators, U.S. legislators. Let's talk about the state. Let's talk about what's going on in some of these districts. First off, where I want to start, because I think sometimes there's a little bit of lack of knowledge concerning this. So, how does the political process work in North Dakota? And obviously, your yeah, how does it work? Let's talk about the Republican process. It's probably the process we're most familiar with the primaries, with the endorsements from the districts, with how it all works.
Yeah, yeah, and here's where, John, you'll have to interrupt me if I go on too long. So I'll break it down because I mean, I actually do a training on this. It's about 2 or 3 hours, so we'll give it the
And
two
you
to
make
three
people pay
minutes
for it?
version. Huh?
You make people pay for that? So we're getting free stuff today?
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Okay,
Yeah, but you're getting the cheaper, shorter version. So,
sounds good.
but okay, so essentially, you have two ways of getting on the ballot. If we're just focused on the candidates themselves, you have a political party organization in every district. There's 47 legislative districts. Each legislative district has one state senator, two state house members, and the local party will meet at a convention, and at that convention they will endorse a candidate, typically, and they'll, endorsement simply means that one candidate gets 100 people to the meeting, the other candidate gets 150. The one who gets 150 probably wins, and then that candidate is declared endorsed. If they win the convention, then the district chairman, who's the leader of the local party in that district, will sign a paper saying that this person won, and then that is filed with the Secretary of State's office in April, and then that person is placed on the ballot in June as a Republican candidate.
Okay.
What also happens is you have candidates who will go out and collect signatures within their district, usually 200 or 300 signatures or whatever. Just depends on what district you're in, what the exact number needs to be. And you go out, collect signatures, you turn those signatures in by the same deadline, which is early April. And if you turn in enough, then you will be placed on the primary ballot as a Republican in that primary as well. So there's two paths to get on to the ballot. And then whoever then prevails in the June primary ballot will then be placed on the general election ballot as the Republican or as the Democrat. So that's the quick version of it.
Right.
So basically, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, an example, and we're going to call out some things here. Is there's an article on the Dakotan about 3 Bismarck Republicans that skipped a local endorsing convention. So that was District 30. District 30 went ahead and endorsed candidates that were there, so they'll be on that ballot. But now the 3 that skipped can go get signatures, so they can also be on that June ballot. Is that basically
Yeah.
understand breaking that
Yeah.
down?
Yep. And there's a lot of interesting dialogue around this dynamic. I'll try to encapsulate it quickly. So I think there's a couple of schools of thought. I mean, first of all, from a philosophic standpoint, I would say that the convention endorsement is much more reflective of what a political party is and should be. You have a
Right.
right to voluntary association of the First Amendment, come together with people of like mind, and you have a right as a private organization to say, hey, this is our candidate. And so that should be decided by the members of that organization. If it's not, then it's not really a private
Right.
organization deciding it. So, however, there's the other school of thought that, a candidate that can display more support, getting signatures in the primary, perhaps they're a stronger candidate for the general election. What's interesting, though, is most often the candidates that get endorsed at the convention level typically, actually, it'd be really interesting to because I don't have all the data tracked out, but it'd be interesting to do that. But I think most of the time they're successful in June. Now, there is kind of let's use that District 30 example. There is sort of a narrative being woven, I would say, typically more by your incumbents, or we'll call it establishment side of the party, that conservative activists have become disproportionately influential in the convention process. And it is true that people that are more dedicated on certain issues as activists tend to be more motivated and tend to have perhaps a disproportionate effect on conventions, right? But at the same time, I think that's a little bit overstated. And I think it's almost a little bit of denialism for some of the incumbents that are being challenged at their convention, because at the end of the day, if you have 100, 200 people show up at a district convention. I mean, these are real flesh and blood people
Right.
in your district, real constituents that are, if they're not supporting the incumbent legislator, they're clearly not happy. And most of the time, again, who's winning the conventions is winning in the June election. We saw this just, for example, in 2022, in District 33, there was a candidate, Keith Boehm, who won the convention, kind of a big upset. His big convention was like 300 people against an incumbent who had raised over six figures, very popular incumbent who had been elected a couple cycles. He won the convention big and then went on to win the June primary big, despite being outfunded like 3-4 to 1.
Yeah.
So I think, the convention is a good test of strength, and so is the primary. But I think overall, they can become pretty synonymous.
Yeah, because that's interesting. You would think, just surface level, like we're just working off this District 30 example. You would think that even though those candidates were endorsed there at that district convention, that in that primary they would have a low chance because they're still, it just got broadened who all is going to be voting, and they don't have that incumbent status, they don't have that name ID status, they don't have those things going for them. But what you're saying, so that's your hypothesis, but what you're saying is that's not true. If you get that endorsement, you most likely will get voted in at that primary.
Yeah, and of course, it all depends on what kind of
Absolutely.
campaign you run and how, because you figure you get 100 people to a convention. If most of them vote for you, you sort of force multiply out from those 100 people. There's your volunteers, your signs, your identifying. If every person there can find 5 people to bring to the polls in June, you've just really won the primary just from that. And I know it's not always that simple, but that's certainly what you try to do. So yeah, for sure.
So why this two-step process? Why not make it you were endorsed by your district, good to go? Why do we have this primary then that is really the district convention's disrespected because you have literally people that get that endorsement of the district and it's ignored by the people that they're opposing, and there's still several names on the ballot come that June primary.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, there's a deep philosophic discussion behind that. Should political parties have what we might call open primaries, like here in North Dakota, where non-Republicans or non-Democrats can vote in their respective primary for their candidates? And yeah, many would argue that is sort of watering down what the real choice of the Republican leadership is. Now, some people might say, well, I don't really care what party leadership wants. I want, the candidate that I can just go to see. And I'm like, go to see it, the primary ballot, more of sort of an independent approach. I'm like, and that's fine too. You can get on the ballot as an independent, but yeah, there's definitely a strong philosophic argument that the party endorsement should be binding and should matter. In some states, that's the case.
Okay.
And in some states, they can actually choose, like in Virginia, where I'm from originally, the local district committee can choose to nominate by convention or by primary. And if they nominate by convention, that result is binding. So if they win the convention in April or whatever, they will be on the November general election ballot as a Republican.
But it's one or the other, not both.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And North Dakota is kind of unique. Yeah.
Do you think that if there was only one and it was at the district level, so that district convention, do you think that there would be more people that would show up for those?
I think very likely, yeah. I think you would drive, yeah, for sure. And of course, it would depend on the dynamics of each race, but and the geography too. Some of these big districts out west, you got to drive almost 3 hours from one end to the other. But yeah, I think it would. I think it certainly would.
And I think it also, we're going to move on from this because the whole goal of it was just to explain how it works in North Dakota. But I think also you have the caveat of some districts with how long you have to be a part to even vote and things like that. There's some bylaws that make it interesting that would potentially be a factor against doing that, which would make sense.
Yeah.
Let's break down some races. All right.
Sure.
What? Give me a few key races. All right. First off, before we jump into this, at the federal level, when we're on election night, November 2024, we're going to be watching Florida, We're going to be watching Ohio. We're going to be watching Pennsylvania. We're going to be watching, and there's a few other states, and we call them swing states because they could go either way. We don't know which way they're going to go, and typically the swing states make the election for one party or the other. North Dakota, truly, it's the same concept with districts. It's just that we're so right now so Republican leaning that you don't even really think about it. But then you have the factions within the party and everything that goes on within the Republican Party that makes things sometimes a little bit interesting. With that in mind, with that setup in mind, understanding the importance of these district races, what are some of the key races that you have in mind?
Yeah, so I think let's just take it district by district here. I think, again, in most races, the battle is going to be in the primary just because we have a super Republican majority.
Right?
So we could sort of look at this in two parts. One would be the primary, one's the general election. Most of the probably most expensive and biggest contested races this cycle will be in June, not in November, because in those districts, you might have a high turnout, a lot of money spent in a Republican district. But then in the general election, whoever the Republican is going to get 60, 70, 80% of the vote, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And that's even if the Democrats run a candidate. In a lot of these districts, they don't.
Right.
So starting in June, I think there's going to be some big primaries. You already mentioned District 30. Obviously, you have two teams, if you will, of a 3-person ticket that are battling it out. That's going to be a really contested primary. There's also potential, in District 2 up in the, which is part of North Williston, Tioga, Crosby, Stanley, that sort of area, oil country area. I don't yet know because not all the candidates have announced, but you have 2 incumbents in the House and at least 1 challenger up there. And that's going to be very interesting because it's been first time there's been a real significant primary challenge, as far as I know, post oil boom in that area. And obviously there's a lot of new people that have moved in, younger people, very different demographic. So that'd be very interesting. And let's see, in District 14, and full disclosure, I'm involved in this race too, just to put that out there. But District 14, right in the middle of the state, very large rural, ag-centric community, includes areas like Herdsfield and Maddock and Rugby, Harvey, Steele. That district very likely is going to have a contested primary. I don't think all the candidates have announced yet, but there are 3 candidates who have announced who are not the incumbents who are running. And I believe the 3 incumbents are most likely to run, as far as I know. And that, again, is a very strong Republican district. I would say there's little, if any, chance a Democrat wins in general election. So that's going to be a very big battle in June. So those are just a couple of districts that I think will have a significant impact on the overall makeup of the Republican legislature. That's for sure.
Districts 30, districts 32 and 14. Those are ones to keep an eye on. Any districts that you think the Democrats have a chance to flip?
Yeah, so that was more, focused in June. So in the general election, and by the way, there will be others, because I just don't want to speak to those because there's a lot less certainty about exactly which candidates might announce, but there will definitely be other contested. Yeah, there'll definitely be some other contested primaries. But where the Democrats might have a chance, certainly. There are certainly some areas where the Democrats might have a shot. Most of those are going to be out east, obviously, Cass County, Fargo, Grand Forks. For example, in Grand Forks, District 18, that's a very purple district, sort of working class, blue collar district there, north part of Grand Forks. If there's a well organized, well funded campaign for the Democrats, it's very possible. And from a perspective from their standpoint as a party, even though they don't have a lot of success statewide or really any right now, they do still have some loyal donors and financial support. And so it does make sense, and they can be effective in targeting that money and resources in a few races and just sort of almost carpet bombing and concentrating their efforts. And they can be effective in those districts. In Fargo, my district where I chair, District 10, you have 2 out of the 3 representatives are Democrats, and I think we are going to be a major sort of inflection point or whatever for resources. District 46, you had 2 Republican incumbents who announced they're not running, and depending on how the primary shakes up in 46, you're going to have 3 Republicans most likely, but it's a purple district, so I would think if the Democrats don't run somebody in 46, they're probably not being very smart.
Right.
Not that I want them to personally. I'm on the Republican side, but it would be unwise for them to not go for it. So those are just a couple of races where I think the Democrats have a real shot at doing something if they run organized campaigns. District 42 is another one in Grand Forks because it's a lot of the college campus,
Right.
more urban type, can demographically lean a little bit. And then finally, the areas where they might have a shot because of the recent court ruling, and the courts, broke up the old sort of 9A, 9B
Right.
district up in Rowlett County in that area, part of the reservation. And now they kind of sort of gerrymandered a little district that goes from Belcourt area all the way down to almost near Devil's Lake. And that district could possibly now be more Democratic leaning. And so even though that's an odd number district, and normally the odd number districts don't happen in the 2024 cycle, that is a place where they definitely have a shot of flipping that seat.
Very good. Yeah, so it's going to be all even number districts and districts 9 and 15 this year?
Yep, just because they are affected by the court ruling.
Very good. Sounds like there's a lot of races to be paying attention to, and this is coming to a close, but is in property tax going to make it on the ballot and get passed?
I think there's a good chance. I'm not involved in the campaign, but I
Right.
hear they've got a good number of signatures, and it's always a gamble sometimes dealing with signatures. You see what you get through the Secretary of State if you get
Right.
approved. But I will say, just anecdotally, talking to people around the state, I think there's an appetite for it. In this economic climate, people's grocery bills are doubling, and I mean everybody's looking at their tax bills. I would say even 6-8 years ago, I don't think the measure would have had as much chance of passing, but now I think it really does. If they get it on the ballot, I think it's got a very good chance of passing.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, we will watch that along with many other things this political season. If you are curious what's going on in the North Dakota races, just head on over to mydakotan.com, and starting tomorrow, you'll be able to click Election Central. And at the Election Central, we'll have a database of all the candidates that are in the races. You can go to their profile page. You'll be able to read all about them. You'll be able to see interviews with them. We'll be accumulating content as the races go on. It's going to be an exciting time. Hopefully, help make informed decisions at the ballot boxes in June at that primary, and then also in November at the general election. Well, Jared, really appreciate you jumping on today. It's been a good time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's fun. I'll just quickly say, hey, I'm glad you guys are doing it. The state really needs a dedicated place, like a hub for election information, because the other newspapers, its coverage is sporadic. So we need a go-to place. So I'm glad you guys are doing it.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you. If you're watching this, be sure to stop by our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. Join the family here.